In the small, peaceful town of Maple Ridge, life moved at a slow and predictable pace. The streets were lined with neat houses, manicured lawns stretched as far as the eye could see, and neighbors exchanged polite greetings during evening walks. It was here that Sarah Thompson, a hard-working woman in her early 40s, had long dreamed of building her perfect home. She wasn't looking for anything extravagant, just a cozy place where she could relax after work, host family gatherings, and create memories. What made this dream even more special was the fact that the land she planned to build on had been passed down through generations. It belonged to her late grandfather, who had always told her stories about its beauty and potential. Sarah's connection to the land ran deep. As a child, she used to visit it often, imagining what kind of house she would build someday. Now, as an adult, she finally had the means to turn those childhood fantasies into reality. She hired architects, drew up plans, secured permits, and even saved enough money to cover most of the construction costs. Everything seemed to be falling into place. But little did Sarah know, her journey was about to take a bizarre and frustrating turn. One crisp autumn morning, Sarah arrived at the site to check on the progress of the excavation crew she'd hired to prepare the foundation. When she pulled up in her car, however, she noticed something odd. There was no activity. The bulldozers sat idle, and the workers milled around aimlessly. Confused, Sarah got out of her car and approached one of them. "What's going on?" she asked. The foreman scratched his head and pointed toward the edge of her property. "Ma'am, we can't get past that train," he said matter-of-factly. "A train?" Sarah echoed, raising an eyebrow. She walked closer to where he was pointing and froze. Sure enough, a massive freight train stretched across the tracks, cutting directly through the only access point to her land. The locomotive stretched endlessly, its steel cars loaded with cargo rumbling slowly along the rails. To make matters worse, the train showed no signs of stopping or moving anytime soon. Sarah felt her heart sink. How could this be happening? She had checked every detail before starting construction. There was nothing in her research or in her grandfather's old documents that mentioned a railway blocking access to her property. Frustrated but determined to find answers, Sarah decided to investigate further. Her first step was to contact the local homeowners association, HOA, which governed the surrounding neighborhood. After all, the HOA was responsible for managing community rules and ensuring residents' properties remained accessible and well-maintained. Surely, they would have some explanation for why a train was parked indefinitely on her doorstep. Sarah called the HOA office and scheduled a meeting with the board members. When she arrived, she found herself sitting across from a group of stern-looking individuals who seemed more interested in sipping their coffee than listening to her concerns. She explained the situation calmly, showing them photos of the train obstructing her land. At first, the board members exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for such a peculiar problem. Then one of them, a man named Mr. Grayson, spoke up. "Ms. Thompson," he began, his tone dripping with condescension. "The reason you're having trouble is because your property falls under our easement agreement with the railroad company." "Easement agreement?" Sarah repeated, feeling a knot form in her stomach. "What does that mean?" Mr. Grayson leaned back in his chair, adopting a patronizing smile. "It means that when the HOA was formed decades ago, we negotiated exclusive rights with the railroad to use this section of track. Unfortunately for you, that includes the portion adjacent to your property. We didn't think anyone would want to develop that land anyway. It's not exactly prime real estate." Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. Not only had the HOA failed to inform her about this so-called easement, but they also acted as if her dreams of building a home were inconsequential. "So you're telling me I can't access my own property because of some deal you made years ago?" she asked, her voice trembling with anger. "That's correct," Mr. Grayson replied, shrugging indifferently. "There's nothing we can do about it now. You'll just have to accept the situation." But Sarah refused to accept it. Over the next few days, she tried everything she could think of to resolve the issue. She spoke to the railroad company, hoping they might offer a solution, but they simply referred her back to the HOA. She reached out to other neighbors, thinking they might sympathize with her plight, but most dismissed her complaints. Some even suggested she sell her land and move on. As the weeks dragged on, Sarah grew increasingly desperate. Each day, the train remained stubbornly in place, mocking her efforts to reclaim control of her future. Construction deadlines loomed, bills piled up, and her savings dwindled. Worst of all, the HOA continued to act as though her predicament was none of their concern. Their dismissive attitude fueled her determination to fight back. But how? It was during one sleepless night, flipping through legal documents related to her property, that Sarah stumbled upon a clue that would change everything. Buried deep within the fine print of the HOA's founding papers was a phrase that caught her attention: unanimous consent required for approval of CC&Rs. CC&Rs stood for covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the legal framework governing the HOA's authority over the neighborhood. At first, Sarah didn't understand the significance of the phrase, but as she read further, a thought began to form in her mind. If unanimous consent was indeed necessary, then even one missing signature could invalidate the entire agreement. Could it be possible that the HOA wasn't as legitimate as it claimed to be? With renewed hope, Sarah decided to dig deeper. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she couldn't give up, not when her dream was hanging by a thread. Little did she realize this small discovery would set off a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of the HOA and transform her life forever. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was onto something big. The phrase "unanimous consent required" kept replaying in her mind like a mantra. She decided to take matters into her own hands and began researching everything she could about the HOA's founding documents. At first, it felt overwhelming. Legal jargon filled page after page, and Sarah wasn't sure where to start. But she reminded herself why she was doing this. This wasn't just about building a house anymore. It was about standing up for what was right and proving that no one, not even an organization as powerful as the HOA, could trample over her rights. Her first step was hiring a lawyer. Though it stretched her budget thin, she knew she needed professional guidance to navigate the labyrinth of legal paperwork. After consulting with several attorneys, she found one named Mark Reynolds, who specialized in property law. Mark was a sharp, no-nonsense man in his 50s with decades of experience under his belt. When Sarah explained her situation, he listened intently, occasionally nodding or jotting down notes. By the end of their meeting, his expression had shifted from skepticism to cautious optimism. "Sarah," he said, leaning forward in his chair, "if what you're saying is true, if there really is a missing signature on the original CC&Rs, then this could be huge. Without unanimous consent, the HOA might not have been legally valid since day one." The words sent a thrill through Sarah. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope, but Mark quickly tempered her excitement with a dose of reality. "Proving something like this won't be easy," he warned. "We'll need concrete evidence, documents, testimonies, anything that shows the HOA didn't follow proper procedures when they were formed." Determined to uncover the truth, Sarah threw herself into the investigation. Her days became a whirlwind of phone calls, library visits, and late-night research sessions. She started by visiting the county courthouse, where old records were stored. The courthouse was a dimly lit building with rows upon rows of dusty filing cabinets. It smelled of aged paper and ink, and Sarah spent hours combing through yellowed documents, searching for any mention of the HOA's formation. At first, progress was slow. Many of the files were incomplete or poorly organized, making it difficult to piece together the full picture. But Sarah refused to give up. She painstakingly sifted through each document, determined to find the smoking gun that would prove her case. Finally, after days of relentless searching, she stumbled upon something promising: a copy of the original petition filed by the HOA when they sought approval from the county. As she flipped through the pages, her eyes widened in disbelief. The document listed the names of all the original property owners who were supposed to have signed off on the CC&Rs, but one name stood out, or rather, didn't. A space designated for Mr. Peterson, a longtime resident of Maple Ridge, was conspicuously blank. There was no signature, no initials, nothing. It was as if someone had simply skipped over him entirely. Sarah's heart raced. Could this be the loophole she'd been looking for? If Mr. Peterson had never agreed to the CCNRs, then the HOA's entire foundation was built on shaky ground. But before she could celebrate, she realized she still needed proof. Just because his signature was missing didn't mean he hadn't given verbal consent or approved the agreement in some other way. To strengthen her case, she needed to track down Mr. Peterson himself. Finding him turned out to be easier said than done. According to public records, Mr. Peterson had sold his home in Maple Ridge years ago and relocated to another state. His current whereabouts were unknown, and Sarah feared she might hit a dead end. But she refused to let frustration get the better of her. She reached out to former neighbors, scoured online directories, and even posted on social media groups dedicated to Maple Ridge history. Slowly but surely, her efforts began to pay off. One afternoon, while scrolling through Facebook, Sarah came across a comment from a woman named Linda Harper. Linda mentioned that her late husband had been friends with Mr. Peterson and recalled him moving to a retirement community in Arizona. Eager to follow up, Sarah messaged Linda and asked if she had any contact information. To her relief, Linda responded promptly, providing the name of the retirement community and a few details about Mr. Peterson's life. With renewed energy, Sarah called the retirement community and requested to speak with Mr. Peterson. After a brief wait, a kind-sounding elderly man picked up the phone. Introducing herself, Sarah explained the situation and asked if he remembered anything about the HOA's formation. Mr. Peterson chuckled softly. "Oh, I remember it all too well," he said. "They tried to pressure me into signing those papers, but I told them I wasn't interested. I didn't want anyone telling me what I could or couldn't do with my property." Sarah's heart soared. This was exactly the confirmation she needed. She thanked Mr. Peterson profusely and arranged to meet him in person so he could provide a sworn affidavit detailing his refusal to sign the CCNRs. Within days, she traveled to Arizona, armed with a stack of documents and a tape recorder. Sitting across from Mr. Peterson in the sunny courtyard of the retirement community, she listened intently as he recounted his memories of the HOA's early days. "They acted like they owned the place," Mr. Peterson said, shaking his head. "But I wasn't about to let them push me around. My family had lived in Maple Ridge for generations, and I wasn't going to give up my independence just because some fancy committee thought they knew better." By the time their meeting ended, Sarah had everything she needed. A signed affidavit from Mr. Peterson, along with copies of the original HOA documents highlighting the missing signature. As she drove back home, she couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, and for the first time in months she allowed herself to believe that justice might prevail. But Sarah knew the fight was far from over. Armed with her newfound evidence, she prepared to take on the HOA, and she was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. With her evidence in hand, Sarah returned to Maple Ridge feeling a mix of emotions: hope, determination, and a lingering sense of unease. She knew she had uncovered something significant, but turning that discovery into action was going to be an uphill battle. The HOA wasn't just any organization. It was a well-oiled machine with deep pockets, influential members, and decades of experience in maintaining control over the neighborhood. They weren't about to roll over simply because one person claimed they had found a flaw in their foundation. Sarah's first step was to sit down with her lawyer, Mark Reynolds, and go over everything she had gathered. Together, they pored over the documents, cross-referencing Mr. Peterson's affidavit with the original HOA records. Every detail seemed to align perfectly: the missing signature, the lack of unanimous consent, and even Mr. Peterson's clear refusal to participate in the agreement. It was undeniable. The HOA's legitimacy rested on shaky ground, but as Mark reminded Sarah, having strong evidence wasn't enough. They needed to present it in a way that would hold up against scrutiny and prepare for the inevitable pushback from the HOA. "They're not going to take this lying down," Mark warned. "When we file our case, they'll fight back hard. We need to make sure we're ready." Determined to build a solid case, Sarah decided to dig even deeper. She wanted to leave no stone unturned, ensuring that every aspect of the HOA's history was thoroughly examined. This meant reaching out to other former residents who might have insights into how the HOA operated during its early years. Some were skeptical at first, unsure why Sarah was stirring up trouble after so much time had passed, but others were eager to share their stories, revealing cracks in the HOA's carefully constructed facade. One such resident was Mrs. Evelyn Harper, an elderly woman who still lived in Maple Ridge. Sarah met her on a sunny afternoon sitting together in Mrs. Harper's cozy living room, filled with faded photographs and knickknacks from decades past. Over cups of tea, Mrs. Harper recounted her memories of the HOA's formation. "They rushed us," she said, shaking her head. "Back then, I didn't think much of it. I figured everyone else was signing, so why shouldn't I? But looking back, I realized they didn't give us much choice. If you hesitated or asked too many questions, they made it clear you'd regret it." Mrs. Harper also confirmed what Sarah already suspected. Pressure tactics were common. She remembered being told that if she didn't sign the CC&Rs, her property value would plummet, and she might face restrictions on selling her home. "It felt like coercion," she admitted. "Not outright threats, but close enough." As Sarah listened, she realized these testimonies could strengthen her case. While the missing signature was the cornerstone of her argument, stories like Mrs. Harper's painted a broader picture of how the HOA had manipulated people into compliance. It wasn't just a technicality, it was a pattern of behavior that undermined fairness and transparency. But gathering evidence wasn't without its challenges. Not everyone was willing to speak out. Some neighbors feared retaliation, while others simply didn't want to get involved. Sarah understood their hesitation but couldn't help feeling frustrated. How could anyone remain silent when the system itself was flawed? Despite the obstacles, Sarah pressed on. She spent countless hours organizing her findings, creating a timeline of events that highlighted the HOA's missteps. She also reached out to local journalists, hoping to bring attention to her cause. Though initially hesitant, a few reporters agreed to look into the story, intrigued by the possibility of corruption within the HOA. Their interest gave Sarah a small sense of validation. It meant she wasn't alone in this fight. Meanwhile, tensions in the community began to rise. Word spread quickly about Sarah's efforts, dividing neighbors into two camps. On one side were those who supported her, seeing her as a champion for justice and accountability. Many of them had quietly resented the HOA's strict rules and high fees, viewing them as unnecessary interference in their lives. Now they saw Sarah's case as an opportunity to challenge the status quo. On the other side were the HOA loyalists, people who believed the association was essential for maintaining order and protecting property values. To them, Sarah was a troublemaker, someone trying to exploit a minor technicality to undermine the entire system. Arguments erupted at neighborhood gatherings, and online forums buzzed with heated debates. For the first time in years, Maple Ridge felt anything but peaceful. The HOA board, meanwhile, remained eerily quiet. They issued vague statements denying any wrongdoing and dismissed Sarah's claims as baseless. Behind closed doors, however, they were scrambling to figure out how to respond. Meetings stretched late into the night as board members debated strategies, hired additional lawyers, and considered ways to discredit Sarah's evidence. Sarah noticed the change in atmosphere. The once friendly faces of her neighbors now carried traces of suspicion, and some avoided her altogether. At times, she wondered if the fight was worth it. Was she prepared to sacrifice her relationships with the people around her for the sake of principle? But whenever doubt crept in, she reminded herself of why she started this journey: to reclaim her land, to stand up for fairness, and to ensure that no one else would have to endure the same injustice. Finally, after weeks of preparation, Sarah and Mark filed their lawsuit. The document outlined every piece of evidence they had collected, from the missing signature to the testimonies of former residents. It argued that the HOA's failure to obtain unanimous consent invalidated its authority and called for its dissolution. As soon as the paperwork was submitted, Sarah felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. Relief because she had finally taken a stand, and anxiety because she knew the real battle was just beginning. The reaction was swift. Within days, the HOA fired back, filing motions to dismiss the case and accusing Sarah of pursuing a frivolous, legal challenge. Their lawyers portrayed her as someone trying to exploit a decades-old oversight for personal gain. Local newspapers picked up the story, amplifying the drama and drawing national attention to the tiny town of Maple Ridge. For Sarah, the spotlight was both exhilarating and exhausting. Reporters camped outside her house, neighbors whispered behind. Her back and social media exploded with opinions. Yet through it all, she stayed focused. She knew the truth was on her side, and she refused to back down. As the court date approached, Sarah found herself reflecting on how far she had come. What started as a simple dream of building a home had turned into a crusade for justice. She hadn't asked for this fight, but now that she was in it, she was determined to see it through. No matter the outcome, she knew she had already achieved something important. She had exposed the flaws in a system designed to keep people powerless. And somewhere deep down, she allowed herself to hope for a verdict in her favor, for a future where she could finally build her dream home, and for a community that valued fairness above all else. The courtroom was packed on the day of the hearing, buzzing with anticipation. Reporters jotted down notes in the back rows while neighbors filled the seats, their faces a mix of curiosity and tension. Some had come to support Sarah, wearing hopeful smiles or giving her encouraging nods as she walked in. Others sat stoically, their arms crossed, clearly siding with the HOA. The air felt heavy with unresolved emotions, anger, frustration, fear, and even excitement. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a public spectacle that had divided an entire community. Sarah took her seat beside Mark Reynolds, her lawyer, who leaned over to whisper words of encouragement. "You've done everything right, so far," he said quietly. "Just stay calm and let the facts speak for themselves." But staying calm was easier said than done. Sarah's heart pounded as she glanced at the opposing table, where the HOA's team of high-powered attorneys sat confidently, surrounded by stacks of documents. They looked untouchable, like a wall she'd never be able to break through. When the judge entered, everyone rose to their feet and the room fell silent. After taking his seat, Judge Thompson, a stern-looking man in his late 50s with graying hair and sharp eyes, began the proceedings. He listened intently as both sides presented their arguments, occasionally interrupting with pointed questions that revealed his skepticism about certain claims. For Sarah, this moment felt surreal. All those months of research, preparation, and sleepless nights were boiling down to one pivotal decision. The HOA's lead attorney, a polished woman named Ms. Caldwell, spoke first. Her tone was smooth and authoritative, designed to project confidence and credibility. She argued that the issue of unanimous consent was irrelevant after so many years. "Your Honor," she began, pacing slowly in front of the bench, "the HOA has operated openly and transparently for over 3 decades. To invalidate its existence now based on a technicality would not only disrupt the lives of hundreds of residents, but also set a dangerous precedent." Ms. Caldwell went on to paint Sarah as someone trying to exploit a minor oversight for personal gain. She claimed that Sarah's lawsuit was motivated by selfishness rather than justice, suggesting that dissolving the HOA would harm property values and destabilize the neighborhood. As she spoke, some members of the audience nodded in agreement, while others exchanged uneasy glances. The message was clear. The HOA wanted the court and the public to see Sarah as the villain in this story. When it was Mark's turn to present Sarah's case, he approached the podium with quiet determination. Unlike Ms. Caldwell, Mark didn't rely on theatrics or grand gestures. Instead, he methodically laid out the evidence piece by piece, allowing the facts to tell the story. He started with the original CC&Rs, pointing to the blank space where Mr. Peterson's signature should have been. "This document is the foundation of the HOA's authority," he explained. "Without unanimous consent, it is invalid from the very beginning." Mark then introduced testimonies from former residents like Mrs. Harper and Mr. Peterson, emphasizing how the HOA had pressured people into compliance. "This isn't just about a missing signature," he argued. "It's about fairness and accountability. The HOA has wielded power for decades under the assumption that its rules are legitimate. But what if they aren't? Shouldn't we hold them to the same standards we expect from everyone else? As Mark continued, Sarah watched the judge closely, searching for any sign of how he was reacting. His expression remained neutral, but she noticed him scribbling notes several times, which gave her a sliver of hope. Mark wrapped up his argument by highlighting the broader implications of the case. If the HOA can operate without following basic legal requirements, he concluded, then what does that say about our system of governance? Today it's Sarah's land. Tomorrow it could be anyone else's rights being ignored. After both sides rested their cases, Judge Thompson announced that he would take some time to review the evidence before delivering his verdict. The delay was agonizing. For weeks, Sarah oscillated between optimism and dread, unable to focus on anything else. Every knock at the door or phone call made her heart race, wondering if it was finally over. Meanwhile, the media coverage intensified, turning the case into a national conversation about homeowners' rights and the role of HOAs. Talk shows debated the ethics of Sarah's challenge, while online forums exploded with opinions from people across the country who had experienced similar struggles. Back in Maple Ridge, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Neighbors who once greeted each other warmly now avoided eye contact, unsure of where allegiances lay. At the grocery store, Sarah overheard snippets of conversations, some supportive, others critical. One afternoon, she ran into Mrs. Harper, who offered her a warm hug. "Don't give up, dear," the elderly woman whispered. "You're doing the right thing." But not everyone was so kind. A few days later, Sarah found an anonymous note taped to her front door. It read, "Drop the lawsuit or face the consequences." Though shaken, Sarah refused to let fear dictate her actions. She knew the stakes were high, but backing down wasn't an option. If anything, the intimidation only strengthened her resolve. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. Once again, the courtroom was packed, and the atmosphere crackled with nervous energy. Sarah sat upright, clutching Mark's hand tightly as Judge Thompson entered and took his seat. Clearing his throat, he began reading his decision aloud. "The court finds that the absence of unanimous consent in the original CC&Rs renders the HOA's formation invalid," he declared, his voice steady and authoritative. Gasps rippled through the room as he continued. Furthermore, the evidence provided demonstrates a pattern of coercion and manipulation during the HOA's early years. Based on these findings, the court orders the dissolution of the Homeowners Association effective immediately. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then chaos erupted. Supporters erupted into cheers, hugging Sarah and congratulating her on her victory. Opponents sat stunned, their faces pale with disbelief. Journalists scrambled to capture reactions, while cameras flashed wildly. Amid the commotion, Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks. She had won, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless against the HOA. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around her, firing questions about how she planned to move forward. But Sarah barely heard them. Her mind raced with thoughts of what this meant for her future, and for the future of Maple Ridge. The blockade that had once seemed insurmountable was gone, replaced by a newfound sense of freedom. And though the road ahead wouldn't be easy, she knew she had proven something important, that standing up for justice, no matter how daunting the odds, was always worth it. The courtroom verdict echoed far beyond the walls of that small-town justice building. It wasn't just a legal decision. It was a seismic shift for Maple Ridge and its residents. The judge's ruling that the HOA was dissolved due to the lack of unanimous consent in its founding documents sent shockwaves through the community. For Sarah, it was a moment of vindication after months of relentless struggle. But as she stepped out into the bright sunlight outside the courthouse, surrounded by cheers from supporters and flashing cameras, she knew this victory came with responsibilities. In the days following the ruling, life in Maple Ridge began to change dramatically. Without the HOA, the rigid rules that had governed the neighborhood for decades suddenly disappeared. Neighbors could paint their houses whatever color they wanted, plant gardens without approval, and make renovations without fear of fines or penalties. At first, some embraced these newfound freedoms enthusiastically. Front yards transformed overnight as people expressed themselves in ways they'd never been allowed to before. One family painted their house bright turquoise with purple trim, bold choice that became a symbol of defiance against the old regime. Others started tearing down fences to create shared spaces or installed solar panels on rooftops. But not everyone celebrated the loss of structure. Some residents worried about what would happen next. Would property values plummet? Could the neighborhood maintain its charm without someone enforcing uniformity? These concerns sparked heated debates at impromptu gatherings around town. In coffee shops, parks, and driveways, neighbors argued passionately about how to move forward. A few even suggested forming a new association, but one built on transparency, fairness, and genuine community input rather than coercion. Sarah found herself at the center of these discussions. People looked to her for guidance, seeing her as a leader who had taken on the system and won. Though flattered, she felt the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders. She hadn't set out to become a spokesperson for change. All she had wanted was to build her dream home. Still, she recognized the opportunity to help shape a better future for Maple Ridge. To address growing concerns, Sarah organized a series of community meetings. Held in the local library, these gatherings brought together neighbors from all walks of life. Some attended out of curiosity, others out of frustration, but most came because they cared deeply about the place they called home. At the first meeting, emotions ran high. Longtime residents voiced fears about losing control, while newer arrivals advocated for more freedom and creativity. Sarah listened patiently, taking notes and encouraging everyone to share their thoughts. By the second meeting, something remarkable began to happen. Compromise. Slowly but surely, the community started finding common ground. They agreed on basics, guidelines for maintaining curb appeal while allowing individual expression. Instead of strict enforcement, they proposed voluntary standards supported by neighborly cooperation. For example, if someone planned to build a tall fence that might block a view, they would discuss it with affected neighbors beforehand. This approach fostered trust and mutual respect, replacing the authoritarian oversight of the HOA with a spirit of collaboration. Meanwhile, Sarah finally turned her attention back to her own land. With the train blockade lifted thanks to negotiations facilitated by local officials who were eager to avoid further conflict, construction crews returned to work. Watching bulldozers clear the site and foundations take shape filled her with a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in years. Every nail hammered and every brick laid brought her closer to the vision she'd carried since childhood. Her dream, home, was no longer an abstract idea. It was becoming real. As the months passed, the transformation in Maple Ridge continued. The absence of the HOA didn't lead to chaos, as some had feared. Instead, it created space for innovation and connection. Community events flourished, from block parties to gardening workshops. Neighbors who had once barely spoken now collaborated on projects like planting trees along the streets or organizing cleanup days. The train tracks that had once blocked Sarah's access became a quirky feature of the landscape, reminding everyone of the strange yet pivotal role they played in the town's history. Word of Maple Ridge's story spread far beyond its borders. Local newspapers published follow-up articles, and national outlets picked up the tale, portraying it as a David and Goliath triumph. Homeowners across the country reached out to Sarah, inspired by her courage and determination. Many shared their own struggles with HOAs, seeking advice on how to challenge unfair practices. Sarah responded to each message personally, offering words of encouragement and sharing resources. She realized her fight had sparked something bigger, a movement toward accountability and empowerment in neighborhoods everywhere. 1 year after the court ruling, Sarah stood on the front porch of her newly completed home, gazing out at the rolling hills and lush trees she loved so much. The house was everything she'd imagined, cozy, welcoming, and uniquely hers. Inside, photos of her grandfather lined the walls, a tribute to the man whose legacy had fueled her journey. As she sipped her morning coffee, She reflected on how far she'd come. Her victory hadn't been easy, nor had it been without cost. She had faced hostility, intimidation, and moments of doubt that tested her resolve. Yet through it all, she had stayed true to her principles. More importantly, she had shown others that standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem insurmountable, is always worth it. That evening, Sarah hosted a small gathering at her home to thank those who had supported her along the way. Friends, neighbors, and even former skeptics mingled in her backyard, laughing and sharing stories under strings of twinkling lights. Someone raised a toast to Sarah, calling her a hero. She blushed, shaking her head modestly. "I'm not a hero," she said. "I'm just someone who refused to give up on my dream and on the belief that fairness matters." As the night wore on, Sarah stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. Looking up at the stars, she felt a deep sense of peace. The battle had changed her, teaching her resilience, patience, and the power of community. It had also reminded her of something her grandfather used to say: "Sometimes you have to dig deep to find your roots, and when you do, you'll discover strength you never knew you had." And so, Sarah Thompson's story became more than just a tale of triumph over adversity. It was a testament to the enduring human spirit, a reminder that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles, hope and perseverance can pave the way to a brighter future for oneself and for an entire community.